I'm Caleb, 32 male. I'm a documentary photographer, which means I spend my life watching other people's stories unfold from behind a lens. I live in a small apartment downtown, surrounded by prints of faces and places that feel more like home than the house I grew up in. For most of my life, I accepted my role as the silent observer in my own family, but that all changed the day they looked me in the eye and erased me with a few simple words. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The scent of my childhood home was an unchanging formula. Lemon-scented polish, my mother's expensive floral perfume, and the faint, sterile smell of a house where emotions were not allowed to get messy. I pulled into the driveway just after 7, the engine of my decade-old car sounding rough and out of place against the quiet hum of the upscale neighborhood. In my passenger seat sat a box of artisanal pastries from a bakery near my studio, a small, hopeful offering I brought to every family dinner, and one that was always met with polite indifference. For a moment, I just sat there looking at the perfectly manicured lawn and the imposing two-story colonial. It was a house built to be photographed for magazines, not to be lived in. Every window was clean, every shutter was perfectly aligned. It was a testament to my family's core philosophy. Appearances are not just important, they are everything. I grabbed the pastry box and walked up the stone path. I used my key, letting myself into the suffocating quiet of the foyer. The house was a museum of our family's success. The walls were lined with achievements, my brother Leo's tech company awards, my sister Alina's law school accolades, and framed photos of my parents at charity galas. My contributions were conspicuously absent. There was no evidence that a third child, a photographer who chose art over commerce, even existed within these walls. I found them in the formal dining room, a space so pristine it felt like a film set. My father, Richard, sat at the head of the table, his attention fixed on the stock market ticker glowing on his tablet. My mother, Marion, was adjusting a centerpiece of white lilies, her movements precise and devoid of warmth. Alina, ever the polished corporate attorney, was recounting a recent courtroom victory, while Leo nodded along, his eyes glued to his phone as he traded cryptocurrencies. No one looked up when I entered. It was a familiar feeling, like being a ghost at a banquet. I found the one empty chair at the far end of the table and set the pastry box down. I brought some croissants, I offered to the silent room. They're from that new place downtown. My mother glanced at the box for a fraction of a second before turning her attention back to the flowers. "That's nice, Caleb, put them on the sideboard." Her tone suggested I had brought a stray animal into her sterile environment. I did as I was told and took my seat, the vast expanse of polished mahogany between me and my family feeling more like a canyon than a table. For the next hour, I listened. I listened to Alina dissect her legal strategy, to Leo boast about a new round of funding, and to my father's occasional grunts of approval. I was an audience member, not a participant. Finally, during a rare lull in the conversation, I saw an opening. I cleared my throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "So some good news from my end," I began, my voice feeling rusty from disuse. "The gallery downtown confirmed my solo exhibition for next spring. It's a series I've been working on for 2 years about the decline of manufacturing towns in the Rust Belt." I waited for a reaction, a nod, a question, anything. Alina took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. "Caleb, we're trying to have a pleasant dinner. Let's not get into your depressing little projects." My mother chimed in, her voice smooth and cutting. "You've always been so dramatic, dear. It's a very performative profession, isn't it? All that manufactured emotion." The word performative landed like a stone in my gut. It was her favorite adjective for my life's work, a polite way of calling it fake. But it was my father who delivered the final blow. He finally looked up from his tablet, his eyes cold and clinical, as if he were assessing a poorly performing asset. "You know, Marion," he said, not to me, but to my mother, "we were just talking about this the other day. If we're being completely honest, having a third child was a mistake." The air in the room froze. He said it with such casual finality, like he was discussing a bad investment. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the words. He wasn't angry, he wasn't emotional, he was just stating a fact. My mother, instead of defending me, simply nodded in agree. "Meant we've said we regret it, Richard. That's not the same as saying we don't love him. Caleb, don't twist this." "Don't twist this." The words echoed in my head. They had just disowned my very existence, and their concern was that I might interpret it incorrectly. My face grew hot, my hands felt cold, and the croissant I had eaten earlier churned in my stomach. You regret having me, I whispered, the question hanging in the air. Leo snorted from behind his phone. Dude, don't be so sensitive, they're just being honest. Alina waved a dismissive hand. You're overreacting. Honestly, this is why no one can have a real conversation with you. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. No one flinched. No one tried to stop me. It was as if I had already disappeared. I walked out of the dining room and down the hall, my feet moving on autopilot. I stopped in front of the photo wall, the shrine to my family's success. There was a new picture since my last visit, a large, professionally shot portrait of my parents, Alina and Leo, all dressed in coordinated shades of blue, smiling perfectly. I scanned the wall, searching for a trace of myself. There was nothing. Even the small graduation photo that used to be tucked away in a corner was gone. In its place was a faint, clean rectangle on the wallpaper, an outline of where I used to be. I touched the empty space, the wall cool beneath my fingertips. It was real. I had been physically erased. I didn't go back to the dining room to scream or to cry. I didn't demand an explanation. Their explanation was hanging on the wall, or rather, it was in the space where I was supposed to be. I walked to the front door, grabbed my jacket, and left. I didn't slam the door. I closed it softly behind me, leaving their perfect, silent house exactly as I found it, only now it felt colder. As I drove away, their words played on a loop in my mind. Not an outburst of anger, but a calm, rational statement of fact. I was a mistake they regretted. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was only the beginning. A week of silence followed that dinner. It wasn't an unusual occurrence. My family operated in long stretches of quiet, punctuated by mandatory gatherings that felt more like corporate board meetings. I threw myself into my work, spending long hours in the darkroom, the smell of chemicals a comfort, the slow emergence of images on paper a predictable and controllable magic. I tried to convince myself that their words didn't matter, that I had built a life for myself far from their sterile approval. But their rejection was a low-frequency hum beneath the surface of my days, a constant reminder of the empty space on the wall. Then came the email from my mother. It was brief and formal with the subject line, "Family Celebration." The body of the email announced a celebratory brunch that Sunday at a high-end restaurant downtown. It was in honor of Alina's promotion to partner at her law firm and Leo's company going public. My name was at the bottom of the recipient list, an afterthought. The email ended with a cheerful, "We have a reservation for the whole family. Please be prompt." For 2 days I debated not going. Every instinct told me to protect myself, to stay away. But a small, stubborn part of me, the part that still craved a seat at the table, refused to be erased so easily. Maybe the dinner had been a lapse in judgment. Maybe they felt guilty. Maybe this was their way of extending an olive branch. It was a foolish hope, but it was enough to make me RSVP with a simple, "I'll be there." I arrived 10 minutes early, a habit ingrained in me from a lifetime of trying not to be an inconvenience. I had chosen my outfit carefully, a crisp button-down shirt and dark jeans, an ensemble that aimed for a blend of casual and respectful. I was trying, as always, to fit in. The restaurant was beautiful, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city park. A hostess with a warm, practiced smile greeted me at the entrance. "Welcome. Are you here for the celebration?" "Yes, for the Miller family," I replied, using my family's name. She tapped on her tablet. "Ah, yes, Richard Miller's party, right this way." She led me not towards the main dining area, where I could see my family already gathered around a large, sunlit table, but in the opposite direction. We walked past the bustling open kitchen, down a short hallway, and into a small, dim alcove tucked away near the service entrance. In the alcove was a single, tiny table set for one, wedged uncomfortably between a large potted fern and a door marked "Staff Only." I stopped, confused. "I'm sorry, there must be a mistake. I'm with the large party in the main room." The hostess's smile faltered for a second. She checked her tablet again, her brow furrowed. "Your name is Caleb, correct?" I nodded slowly. "The reservation notes specify a separate table for you, her." She said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She looked genuinely apologetic. "Table for one." She pulled out the solitary chair for me. I felt a wave of nausea, a separate table, not just at the end of the main table, but in an entirely different section of the restaurant, hidden from view. It wasn't an oversight, it was a statement. It was a meticulously planned act of exclusion. I sat down, my body feeling heavy and numb. From my secluded corner, I had a clear line of sight to their table. There were 10 of them, my parents, Alina and her husband, Leo and his fiancée, and a few of my parents' close friends. They were laughing, clinking champagne glasses, passing around bread baskets. My father was holding court, his voice booming with pride. My mother was smiling, the picture of a happy matriarch. They looked complete. There were no empty chairs at their table. My existence hadn't just been forgotten, it had been deliberately hidden. They wanted to celebrate their perfect family without the uncomfortable presence of their mistake. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, watching them, a spectator at my own family's celebration. I didn't order anything. A waiter came by once, looked confused, and then scurried away. After about 20 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up and walked to the restroom, my legs unsteady. I splashed cold water on my face, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My neat shirt, my combed hair, it all felt like a costume for a play I had no role in. I looked like someone trying to belong to something that had already cast me out. As I walked back towards my lonely table, the hostess who seated me intercepted me near the entrance. She glanced nervously towards my family's table, then leaned in close to me. "I am so sorry about this," she whispered, her eyes full of genuine sympathy. "I saw the note on the reservation myself. The woman who called Eleanor was very specific. She said you preferred a quieter spot." A quieter spot. The lie was so elegant, so Eleanor. It was a perfectly crafted piece of cruelty disguised as a thoughtful accommodation. It painted me as the difficult one, the one with special needs, while ensuring I was kept out of sight. "Thank you for telling me," I said, my voice hoarse. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The hurt was still there, a deep, aching wound. But beneath it, a new feeling began to surface, a cold, clear resolve. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to make a scene. That's what they expected, another performative display of emotion from their unstable son. Instead, I walked calmly to the hostess stand. I took out my phone, pretending to check my messages. With my phone angled just right, I took a clear, high-resolution photograph of the hostess's tablet screen, which still showed the reservation details. It was all there in black and white. Miller party, 10 guests, main dining room. Additional guest, Caleb, 1 guest, alcove table 2B, quieter spot requested. I then walked back to my table and sat down. I stayed there through their entire meal, through their toasts and their laughter and their dessert. I watched them as a documentarian would, observing a strange and foreign tribe. I didn't touch the water glass. I didn't look at the menu. I just sat, a silent witness to my own erasure. When they finally started to get up, exchanging hugs and air kisses, I slipped out a side exit without a word. I didn't want their pitying glances or their feigned surprise at seeing me. I walked out into the bright afternoon sun, the photo of the reservation safe on my phone. I hadn't made a sound, but for the first time I hadn't left empty-handed. I had proof. And I had a chilling new question. If they were willing to erase me this carefully from a brunch table, what else had they erased me from? The image of the reservation notes on the hostess's tablet burned in my mind for days. A quieter spot requested. The polite, clinical cruelty of it was my sister Eleanor's signature. It wasn't just an insult, it was a strategy. It was the kind of move a lawyer makes, clean, precise, and designed to be deniable. That single act of calculated exclusion became a key, unlocking a part of my mind that had been dormant for years. I had spent a lifetime accepting their narrative of me as overly sensitive and difficult. But this wasn't about my feelings. This was a deliberate, documented action. What other actions had I missed? My thoughts kept returning to the family cabin at Fontana Lake. It was a rustic A-frame structure my grandfather had built, the one place where I had felt a sense of belonging as a child. A few years back, it had fallen into serious disrepair after a storm. My parents talked about selling the land, but I couldn't bear the thought. At the time, I had just sold a major photo series and had a substantial amount in my savings. I offered to fund the entire restoration myself. It was a significant sum, and early all of my savings, but it felt important. I didn't want to be a co-owner in the traditional sense, I just wanted to save it. I told them to consider it my contribution to the family legacy. My father had clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're finally stepping up, son, it's good to see." They had me sign a formal contribution letter, which my mother, ever the stickler for paperwork, had notarized. The memory of that day now felt sinister. Had my contribution been acknowledged, or had it been absorbed and forgotten just like me? A cold dread washed over me. I needed to find that paperwork. I knew exactly where it would be. In a storage unit I rented on the industrial outskirts of town. It was a metal box filled with the ghosts of my former life, old photography equipment, tax documents from my lean years, and half a dozen boxes of personal records I'd packed away after my last apartment move. That evening I drove to the facility. The air inside the long concrete corridor was cold and smelled of dust and forgotten things. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile greenish glow on the rows of identical metal doors. I found my unit, 204, and wrestled with the stiff, rolling door until it screeched open. The contents were just as I'd left them, a chaotic jumble of my past. I scanned the labels on the stacked cardboard boxes, my breath misting in the cold air. Darkroom supplies, college textbooks, financials 2015-2020. Finally, in the back corner, I found the one I was looking for, marked in my own faded handwriting, family documents and Fontana cabin. I dragged the heavy box into the light of the corridor and pried open the lid. Inside were old birthday cards, letters, and a collection of meticulously organized file folders, my mother's influence. I pulled out the folder labeled Fontana Restoration. My hands trembled slightly as I sifted through the contents. It was all there. The original contractor bids, receipts for lumber and materials, and at the very front, the bank statement showing the wire transfer. My eyes scanned the page, a single transaction for $43,000 from my savings account to the Miller Family Trust. The memo line read, "For Fontana Cabin Restoration." Beneath it was the notarized contribution letter I had signed. It clearly stated that my financial contribution was made in exchange for a continued recognized stake in the family property. I felt a small wave of relief. I had proof. It wasn't just a memory, it was a legal and financial reality. But as I continued to dig through the folder, my relief curdled into ice. Tucked into a separate envelope at the very back was a document I had never seen before. It was a thick stack of papers, paper-clipped together with the letterhead of a prestigious Charlotte law firm, the Leaner's firm. The title at the top read, "Amended and Restated Declaration of the Miller Family Trust." I started reading, my heart pounding against my ribs. It was dense with legal jargon, but the intent was brutally clear. It was an official amendment to the family's property trust. I scanned the pages for the section on beneficiaries, my finger tracing the lines of text. There they were: Richard Miller, Marion Miller, Eleanor Miller, Leo Miller. My name wasn't there. I read the section again and then a third time. I wasn't listed as a contributor. I wasn't listed as a beneficiary. I wasn't mentioned at all. According to this document, I had no legal connection to the cabin I had single-handedly saved. Then I saw the date. The amendment was dated May 17, 2021. The air left my lungs in a rush. May 2021. I knew that month all too well. It was the month of my accident. I had been on assignment in the mountains, documenting storm chasers, when a bad turn on a wet road sent my car skidding off an embankment. I'd woken up in a hospital with 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and a punctured lung. I'd had 2 surgeries and spent nearly 10 days in a medically induced haze, drifting in and out of consciousness. They had restructured the trust while I was lying in a hospital bed, unable to speak, unable to protest, unable to even know it was happening. My family, led by my lawyer sister, had used the moment of my greatest vulnerability to legally and financially sever me from our shared history. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It was an opportunity. I sank to the cold concrete floor, the papers clutched in my hand. The quiet dinner, the empty space on the wall, the separate table at brunch, they weren't isolated incidents of casual cruelty. They were the final steps in a long, calculated campaign of erasure. They hadn't just decided I was a mistake, they had acted on it. They had waited until I was helpless, and then, with the stroke of a pen, they had written me out of the family. I sat there in the silent, dusty corridor of the storage facility for a long time. The initial shock gave way to a profound and chilling clarity. This was no longer about hurt feelings or a fight for affection. This was about a calculated theft, both of my money and my identity, and they had left a paper trail. I carefully gathered every single document, the wire transfer, the notarized letter, the trust amendment, and placed them in a new, clean folder. As I walked out of that storage unit and into the night, I was no longer just the forgotten son. I was a man with evidence. The next morning, I did something I had never done before. I sought professional help to fight my own family. I found a lawyer, a man named Mr. Klein, who specialized in estate and property disputes. He had a small, unpretentious office filled with dusty law books and the comforting smell of old paper. He listened patiently as I laid out the story, my voice steady as I presented the documents one by one. The notarized contribution letter, the bank transfer, the brunch reservation photo, and finally, the trust amendment dated during my hospital stay. Mr. Klein adjusted his glasses and examined the amendment. He was silent for a long time, his expression growing more grim with each page he turned. "This is meticulous," he finally said, looking up at me. "Your sister is a very thorough lawyer. She didn't just remove you, she structured this amendment to make it appear as though the original trust was flawed and this was a necessary correction for tax purposes. It's designed to look like a simple administrative update." "But it was done when I was incapacitated," I insisted. "Is that legal?" It's highly unethical and it demonstrates clear intent to defraud, he explained. They had a fiduciary duty to act in your best interest as a known contributor, especially while you were unable to represent yourself. They didn't. Instead, they took advantage of your absence to disinherit you from a property you have a documented financial stake in. He paused, his gaze softening with a hint of sympathy. Caleb, this wasn't just a family disagreement. This was a planned, predatory action. Hearing my deepest fears validated by a legal professional was both terrifying and empowering. It wasn't just in my head. I wasn't just being performative. I had been wronged in a way that had legal consequences. What are my options? I asked. We can file a petition to contest the amendment based on fraudulent inducement and breach of fiduciary duty, he said. We demand that the trust be restored to its original state, recognizing your contribution and stake. Or, we can sue for the return of your $43,000 plus interest and damages. The money was secondary, it was the principle of the thing, it was the erasure. I want to contest the amendment, I said without hesitation. I want my name put back where it belongs. Mr. Klein nodded. Good, that's the stronger position. It shows this is about your rights, not just the money. He filed the initial petition the following week. A certified letter was sent to my father as the primary trustee, and a courtesy copy was sent to a Leaner's law firm. The first shot had been fired, not with a shouted accusation, but with a quiet, formal legal document. The response was faster and more vicious than I could have ever imagined. Less than 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived at my apartment from a Leaner's firm. It wasn't a settlement offer or a request for mediation. It was a formal countersuit. I sat at my small kitchen table and read it, each word a carefully aimed blow. They weren't just defending their actions, they were attacking my character. The lawsuit claimed that I was emotionally and mentally unstable, and therefore unfit to be a party to the family trust. It cited my erratic behavior and history of creating family discord. And then came the most brutal part. They had subpoenaed my medical records from the hospital stay after my accident. The countersuit included excerpts from my therapist's notes, sessions I had agreed to as part of my recovery, a safe space where I had talked about my feelings of isolation and my lifelong struggle to connect with my family. They were twisting my vulnerability into a weapon. My pain was now Exhibit A in their case against me. The legal document painted a picture of me as a paranoid, unstable person who was lashing out and trying to extort money from his loving, supportive family. It mentioned my unprofitable and emotionally taxing career choice as a sign of my poor judgment. It even referenced the dinner where they had called me a mistake, reframing it as a candid and loving attempt to communicate their concerns about my life path, which was met with a disproportionate and hostile reaction. I felt the blood drain from my face. This was a Leaner's masterpiece of cruelty. She had taken every private fear, every moment of weakness I had ever shown, and woven it into a legal narrative designed to utterly discredit me. It wasn't enough to steal my inheritance, they had destroy my reputation and rewrite my reality to justify it. They were trying to erase my credibility just as they had erased my name from the trust. That night I couldn't sleep. The legal jargon from the countersuit swirled in my head: emotionally unstable, compromised judgment, history of withdrawal. They were the same words my mother had used for years, only now they were stamped on a legal document given the weight of the law. They were trying to make their opinion of me a legal fact. For a moment I considered dropping the whole thing. The thought of my private therapy sessions being picked apart in a courtroom by my own sister was nauseating. They were counting on that. They were counting on me to retreat, to crumble under the weight of the shame and humiliation. They expected me to go back to being the quiet, invisible son who never caused a fuss. But as I sat there in the dark, staring at the lawsuit on my table, the fear began to recede, replaced once again by that cold, hard resolve. They had left me with nothing to lose. They had already taken my place in the family, my inheritance, and now they were trying to take my sanity. I would not let them. This was no longer just about a cabin. It was about my right to exist, to have my story and my truth be seen. They had escalated this into a war on my character. And I realized I had a weapon they hadn't anticipated: the truth told in my own voice. The countersuit was a declaration of war. My family, led by Leaner's legal savagery, had made it clear they would not just defend their position, they would annihilate mine. My lawyer, Mr. Klein, warned me that these cases could get ugly. They're going to put your entire life on trial, Caleb, he'd said, his voice grave. They want to prove you're an unreliable narrator of your own story. We can fight it, but it will be a painful process. For a few days, I felt cornered. The thought of a public court battle, of having my deepest vulnerabilities dissected by a Leaner in front of a judge, was suffocating. They were baiting me into a fight on their turf, the courtroom, where they knew all the rules and I knew none. They expected me to either lash out emotionally, proving their point about my instability, or retreat in fear. I knew I couldn't win by playing their game. I had to change the venue. The opportunity arrived in the most unexpected way. An email appeared in my inbox with the subject line, "Invitation to speak, Asheville Arts Council panel." I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but I opened it out of curiosity. A local arts organization was hosting a public forum and a series of talks on the theme of invisible work. They were looking for artists whose work shed light on overlooked communities or untold stories. A professor at the local university, who was familiar with my Rust Belt photography series, had recommended me. I read the email twice. Invisible work. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. My entire life had been a case study in invisible work. The emotional labor of trying to belong, the financial contribution that was erased, the silent role I played as the family ghost. My family had made me an expert on the topic. An idea began to form in my mind, a dangerous and exhilarating spark. What if I accepted? What if instead of fighting their accusations in a sterile courtroom, I told my story in a public forum? What if I used my voice not to argue legal points but to speak a simple human truth? They had tried to silence me in private, to erase me on paper. But they couldn't control a public narrative. They couldn't edit a story once it was told out loud. This was my chance to reframe the entire conflict. They wanted to make it about my mental state, about my supposed instability. I would make it about something far more universal, the quiet, painful experience of being rendered invisible by the people who are supposed to see you most clearly. But I knew I couldn't just get on stage and rail against my family. That would make me look vengeful and unstable, playing right into their hands. I needed a tool, something that was undeniably true and emotionally resonant, something they couldn't dismiss as a performative outburst. That's when I remembered my childhood diaries. I still had them, tucked away in the bottom drawer of my desk in a dusty shoebox. A collection of cheap, spiral-bound notebooks filled with the clumsy handwriting of a lonely kid trying to make sense of his world. I hadn't looked at them in over a decade. With a strange sense of reverence, I pulled them out. I spent an entire afternoon reading through the pages, my own past speaking to me across the years. The entries were a heartbreaking chronicle of my invisibility. Age 9, Mom and Dad took Ellie and Leo to the city for a show. They forgot to tell me they were leaving. I waited for them to come get me for dinner. Mrs. Gable from next door brought me a sandwich. Age 12, for my birthday, I got a gift card. Ellie got a new tennis racket and Leo got a computer. My card was for the bookstore. It was nice, but I think they forgot what I liked. They were talking about Leo's science fair project the whole time. And then I found it, a short, simple entry from when I was 10 years old. It wasn't angry or sad, it was just a quiet, devastating observation. I had written, "Sometimes I think I am a piece of furniture that learned how to talk. They seem surprised when I make a noise." I read the line over and over again. It was the purest distillation of my entire life experience. It was written long before my accident, long before the therapy they were now using as a weapon. It was the voice of a child, innocent and irrefutable. It was not the product of a compromised mind, it was the observation of a lonely heart. This was it, this was my evidence. This was the centerpiece of my plan. I emailed the Arts Council back and accepted their invitation. I told them I would be honored to speak on the topic of invisible work. I didn't tell them what I was going to talk about. For the next week I prepared. I didn't write a speech. I didn't craft legal arguments. I simply chose that single diary page. I would not bring a lawsuit to the stage. I would bring a memory. I would let a 10-year-old boy speak for the 32-year-old man. My plan was simple and, I hoped, effective. I would let my family know about the event. Alina's arrogance and need for control would almost guarantee her attendance. She would come to watch me, to monitor me, perhaps even to intimidate me. She would expect a fight, a messy emotional breakdown that she could use as further evidence against me. I would not give her one. I would give her the one thing she couldn't argue with, the one thing she couldn't cross-examine, our shared past. I would hold up a mirror, not a sword. And I would do it in a room full of people where her usual tactics of dismissal and gaslighting would be seen for what they were. I was going to take their greatest weapon, my supposed emotional fragility, and turn it into my greatest strength. The Asheville Civic Center auditorium was smaller than I expected, with about 100 folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing a simple wooden stage. The lighting was soft, the atmosphere academic and respectful. The audience was a mix of students, local artists, and curious residents. It was the perfect venue, intimate enough for my story to land, public enough to be a record. I sat on stage with two other panelists, a sociologist and a poet, my heart hammering a steady, nervous rhythm against my ribs. I clutched a small, folded piece of paper in my jacket pocket, the page from my diary. It felt both as flimsy as a leaf and as heavy as a stone. I scanned the audience as the host gave his opening remarks. And then I saw her, Eleanor. She was sitting in the third row, perfectly poised, dressed in an expensive-looking charcoal blazer. She wasn't trying to hide. She had come to bear witness, to project an aura of calm, familial support that was in itself a form of intimidation. She gave me a small, tight smile, a look that said, "I'm watching you, don't you dare." My turn came last. The host introduced me. Our final speaker is Caleb Miller, a documentary photographer whose work captures the quiet dignity of communities often overlooked. I walked to the lectern, my legs feeling strangely disconnected from my body. The microphone hissed softly as I adjusted it. The faces in the audience blurred into a collage of polite expectation. I took a deep breath. For most of my life, I began, my voice clearer and stronger than I expected, I thought that being loved meant taking up as little space as possible. I thought that if I was quiet enough, helpful enough, and invisible enough, I would eventually earn my place. I saw a few heads nod in understanding. I had their attention. I come from a family that values achievement, tangible, visible success. They have walls filled with awards, diplomas, and photographs celebrating their victories. I used to have a small spot on that wall. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air. And then one day, I didn't. I saw Eleanor shift in her seat, her smile tightening at the edges. She knew where this was going. To be rendered invisible is a strange and quiet kind of pain, I continued. It's not a loud, violent act, it's an erasure. It happens in the empty chair at a celebration, in the name left off a legal document, in the space on a wall where a photo used to be. The room was completely silent now. Then Eleanor stood up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think some context is needed here." The host looked startled. "Ma'am, there's a Q&A session after the presentations." "I won't take a moment," Eleanor insisted, her eyes locked on me. "I'm his sister. I just want everyone to know that my brat. Her has been through a great deal. He suffered a serious accident a few years ago and has had some significant mental health struggles since. Our family loves him and supports him completely, but sometimes he misinterprets things." There it was, her entire legal strategy, delivered in a tidy two-sentence assassination wrapped in the guise of loving concern. She was painting me as the broken, unreliable narrator in front of a live audience. The whispers started to ripple through the crowd. People were looking at me differently now, with pity and suspicion. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but I held my ground. I didn't look at her, I looked at the audience. I let the weight of her accusations settle in the room. This was the moment. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. Instead, I reached into my pocket and slowly unfolded the single, yellowed page from my diary. I held it up. "My sister is right," I said calmly. "I have struggled, but my experience of being invisible didn't start with an accident." I looked down at the page. This is an entry from a diary I kept when I was 10 years old. I held the paper with both hands, my fingers steady. I read the single line aloud into the microphone. "Sometimes I think I am a piece of furniture that learned how to talk. They seem surprised when I make a noise." A profound, absolute stillness fell over the auditorium. The words, spoken in my adult voice but so clearly born from a child's heart, echoed in the quiet room. They were simple, devastating, and utterly irrefutable. It was not the testimony of an unstable man. It was the lonely observation of a little boy. I looked up from the page and met Eleanor's gaze. For the first time in my life, I saw her polished facade crack. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock and then fury. I had used a weapon she could not counter, our own history. She could dismiss my adult feelings, but she could not argue with the ghost of a 10-year-old boy. I folded the paper and placed it back in my pocket. "The most difficult invisible work in the world," I said, my voice thick with emotion but not breaking, "is the work of simply existing in a place that is determined to pretend you are not there." I stepped back from the lectern. For a beat, there was silence. Then a single person in the back began to clap. Another joined in and then another until the entire room erupted in applause. It wasn't polite, it was heartfelt, a wave of validation that washed over me. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment before turning and practically fleeing the auditorium, her face a mask of cold rage. She had lost control of the narrative. As I walked off the stage, my knees shaking with relief, A woman with a press badge approached me. "I'm Sarah Jenkins with the Asheville Daily," she said, her eyes bright with intensity. "That was one of the most powerful things I've ever heard. Can I talk to you? I think your story needs to be told." I nodded, unable to speak. The applause was still ringing in my ears. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't lost my temper. I had simply told the truth. They could countersue, they could lie, they could erase my name from 1,000 documents, but they couldn't take back the story I had just told. It was out in the world now, it was real, and it was mine. The article came out 3 days later. It was on the front page of the local newspaper's lifestyle section under the headline, "The Invisible Man, Local Artist Speaks Out on the Erasure We Don't See." Sarah Jenkins, the journalist, had done a masterful job. She didn't sensationalize it. She just told the story, weaving quotes from my panel's speech with a sensitive exploration of the themes of familial neglect and psychological erasure. She even included the line from my diary. Seeing those words in print credited to me was a profound moment. It was the opposite of being erased, it was being etched into the public record. The fallout was immediate and quiet. My family didn't issue a statement. Alina didn't threaten to sue the newspaper for libel. There was just a deafening silence from their end. But the community's response was anything but silent. My email and social media were flooded with messages from strangers who had read the article. People shared their own stories of feeling invisible in their families, of being the furniture that learned how to talk. I had spoken my specific truth, and in doing so I had touched a universal chord of human experience. I wasn't alone. About a week after the article was published, a package arrived at my door. It was a plain cardboard box with no return address. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was the old family photo album, the one that had always been on display in my parents' living room. I opened it, and there on the first page was the graduation photo that had been removed from the wall. Tucked behind it were a dozen other pictures of me that had been missing for why. Here's me at age 7 with a toothy grin, at 14 on a family trip, at 20 at my college art show. There was no note, no explanation, just the silent return of my captured past. I knew it was from my mother. It was her way of communicating, not with words of apology, but with a quiet, corrective action. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was an acknowledgement. The biggest shift, however, came from my father. An envelope arrived with his shaky, unfamiliar handwriting on it. It wasn't a card, it was a letter, the first one he had ever written to me. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter was short and painfully honest. He wrote that one of his old business partners had sent him the newspaper article. He said he read it and felt nothing but a deep, hollow shame. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to justify their actions. He simply wrote, "When I read what you wrote as a child, I saw for the first time the son I had refused to see. There is no excuse for a father who makes his child feel like an object." He went on to say that he had confronted Alina. He had given her an ultimatum. Either she begin the legal process of dissolving the amended trust and reinstating me as a full beneficiary of the Fontana Lake property, or he would do it himself and publicly disavow her actions. He ended the letter with 2 simple, staggering words: "I am sorry." Tears streamed down my face as I read the letter. It wasn't the triumphant courtroom victory I had once imagined. It was something quieter, more broken, and infinitely more meaningful. It was the cracking of a dam of denial that had stood for 32 years. Within a month, the legal battle was over. Mr. Klein informed me that Alina had, under duress from my father, filed the paperwork to have the fraudulent trust amendment nullified. My name was back on the deed to the cabin. I was no longer a ghost in my own family's legacy. I didn't go back to their house for dinner. I didn't force a family reunion. The damage was too deep for that. The trust between us, unlike the one on paper, could not be so easily restored. Instead, I drove up to Fontana Lake. The cabin was just as I remembered it, nestled among the tall pines, the air smelling of earth and water. It was neglected, but its bones were strong. I spent the next several months bringing it back to life, not just restoring it, but reclaiming it. I sanded the floors, repainted the walls, and built new bookshelves. I filled them not with my family's history, but with my own. On the main wall above the fireplace, where a stuffy family portrait might have once hung, I mounted a large framed print of my favorite photograph from my Rust Belt series, a shot of an old, resilient factory worker staring proudly into the lens. Next to it, I hung a small, simple frame. Inside was the original yellowed page from my 10-year-old diary. It wasn't a reminder of the pain. It was a reminder of the truth that had set me free. My relationship with my family remains complicated and distant. My mother sends me packages. My father and I exchange occasional, awkward emails. I haven't spoken to Alina or Leo since the day of the panel. I have come to accept that a happy ending doesn't always mean everyone sitting around a table together. Sometimes a happy ending is just sitting at your own table in a home you have built for yourself and feeling at peace. One evening, as the sun set over the lake, casting a golden glow on the water, I stood on the porch of the cabin. I was no longer the invisible man, the family mistake, or the piece of furniture that learned to talk. I was just Caleb, a man who had found his voice, reclaimed his story, and finally truly come home.